Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP-1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of MSP 1337. This week, yes, we are running a little bit late. I apologize. Sometimes good conversations have to wait. This week, I'm joined by Matthew Schroeder. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here. I really appreciate it.
So Matthew and I go back several years. Matthew was a former student of mine where we were engaged in the learning of basic networks. And some of our conversations stemmed around, hey, go read an article about networks or something technology related and tell me what you got from that. And I didn't have this as a class homework assignment just because I thought they should do that, just because this is something that I do all the time. I spend time reading articles that might help me in my career. And I thought if I could impart something on somebody else, it would be to go out and do the same as I'm doing so that down the road, you are better equipped to answer questions in the field of technology. And in our case, more specifically, cybersecurity. So Matthew, if you could just fill us in a little bit on sort of the path you've taken. You were sharing with me earlier that you're pursuing a master's degree in cybersecurity management. And I would just love for you to share with our listeners what that means and sort of maybe kind of recap some of the conversations as that, for those that don't know, Matthew and I get on a call about once a week and we just talk about what we're seeing in the news and just kind of have casual conversation, which quite honestly may need to become its own podcast.
Yeah, so kind of just going straight back to that class and you assigning, the articles, that was something that I thoroughly enjoyed reading about because there was a lot of trending stuff and there's always something involving in technology. And I think that urged me in the future after taking that course. I always found myself, continuing to look at articles and seeing what's the new thing. And it kind of just ended up with me here, studying cybersecurity management, just trying to help out and bridge the gap. So,
well, I think that's I didn't intend necessarily for that to be a takeaway from class, but I think about it now, and I think about as I work towards encouraging my team, those that work for me, and to our peers and colleagues listening to this show, is that your employees really need to be consuming articles and news that pertain to the field that you're working in to stay relevant, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was one thing that I noticed and that they emphasized and just like my studies so far is just about how constantly evolving everything is. And they always emphasized, the new regulations and compliances that you always need to stay up with. And because even like governments and organizations all around the world are, they're just along the same path as we are about, how to interact with these things and new technologies.
So I know that one of the things that we might talk about on a weekly conversation would be like, what's happening in the news. And as we were starting this conversation, it just popped into my head, have you read about the Colonial Pipeline, right? Like the ransomware. Did you read about that at all?
Of course. And kind of like one huge thing that I was actually thinking about asking you is about just like the recovery plan and kind of like the process about that, because I know like that's a huge thing, to implement in a lot of companies and organizations, to bring back up to the standard. And I thought it was interesting how they completely shut it down and before they were able to figure some things out. So,
well, I just, we talk about infrastructure a lot, not necessarily you and I talking about it, but I think that's a big conversation around security and like the impact to, even if we were just to focus on the United States, the fragility of our network infrastructure, whether it's, the dams that supply water, or the pipelines, or the oil rigs, oil refineries. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Power plants, you name it. And one of the things that was really interesting, in my opinion, as I've been kind of following the Colonial Pipeline stuff, is what was the repercussions of this, right? Because we think about, okay, Colonial Pipeline shut down, that hurts, that's painful. You've got states that are like without gas to supply,
Mhm.
gas stations, right?
Yeah, I had my own family actually be affected by this because they couldn't get gas, which was crazy to think about, and it makes you think about the possibilities of what will be next. And that almost kind of gives me optimism in this field because I know that there is something that needs to be worked on and
Sure.
something to be improved upon. And I want to kind of, be a part of that.
Well, and I don't want to, continue too far down this rabbit hole, but what was interesting is I think about like electric cars, like the whole Tesla movement, and the ability to like, okay, I can drive from California to New York, and there's these charging stations along the way, right? So over
Mhm.
time, as they put the charging stations in, now it's reasonable to get across the country. Well, if we think about how the gas station and a car that consumes gas, your gas tank is proportionate to its need to get gas, right? So on the high end, you might get close to 400 miles on a tank of gas, depending on what kind of car and fuel efficiency. But that gas tank shrinks or grows based on sort of that formula to get you that far on a tank of gas. So if you have a shortage of gas stations, not having gas to put in your car, how quickly we end up in a crumbling effect when you leave an urban population to start traveling across country, where, next gas station, 135 miles, you're like, oh, I don't, no problem, I've got, quarter tank of gas left, I can do 135 miles. And then you get there and they don't have gas, and the
Mhm.
next gas station is another 85 miles, but you don't have enough fuel in your tank to get that far. We didn't really see that happen here, sort of, with the Colonial Pipeline. It was a smaller, yes, there are percentages of gas stations that have gas, but like, had this been a bigger,
Oh yeah,
crumble effect.
definitely. It definitely makes you think about the possibilities about what could be the implications of future attacks, and that could be even worse, and how they could be effective to the people in society and stuff like that.
Or would it have even mattered last year, same time? So last May, would it have mattered to the general population? Would it have been a big deal to be like, oh, well, 14% of the gas stations and wherever it was don't have gas? It's like, well, I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't going
Uh,
anywhere anyways, right?
yeah, so it's all about I think it was definitely a case of like perfect timing too with everything that's been going on too. So.
And I've had some recent conversations. I actually had a guy hit me up on LinkedIn a couple weeks back, and he's like, "Hey, I want to pick your brain about the OT instead of IT." And I'm like Googling OT, like, I'm scratching my head. I'm like, OT. And he was
Mhm.
talking about, like infrastructure technology, like operational,
Oh, okay.
machinery. Like, so like he was talking about like refineries, oil rigs, those types of things. And that's the world he lives in. He's from Texas. And he was talking about how you could drive down the street, and on the right hand side, there's an oil rig in some guy's backyard, or not an oil rig, but a drill that's pumping oil out. And, that's basically, it's got a fence around it, and that's it. And he's like, and then on the other side of the road, you've got a refinery that's got razor wire and, armed, a security guard, like you just can't go in there, kind of thing. And he goes, my fear isn't that one of those facilities isn't dialed in on security. He goes, it's a domino thing, right? He's like, so if one of those things were to get compromised, what would be the domino effect that happens to everything else that's in that, say, 10 or 20-mile radius that isn't structured the same way, right? And I was
Yeah.
like, man, thanks for bringing that up. That makes me feel really good. Guess what? I'm not going to Texas anytime soon.
Yeah.
It just separated from the rest of the United States when the explosion happened, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so, anyways, there's just so much happening, right? Like we've talked about this before. The opportunities to some extent are endless, and it's like, where does one focus? So you're looking at your future and going, where do I want to work? What type of job do I want to do? Obviously that could change over time, right? As you gain experiences in different paths. But what's like the one area that if you were to just go pick something that is more intriguing to you, say, than others as you're looking to, you know, take that first leap? I mean, because I've been doing this for 20 years and I still look at it and go, if I were to leap now, where would I go? Because I've barely scratched the surface and I've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, well, kind of if I were to just jump into it, the first thing I, would probably have the most fun and most interest in would be, assessing systems and such as like it could be anything from vulnerabilities and do like pen testing or even like auditing different processes and systems because I kind of thought about this a lot, and I think if I did that and audited a lot of different things, I would kind of get a good view of what's on the landscape and hopefully find a more particular interest that might further my career path down the road. So that's kind of where my thought is, on it as like a prospective person in the field and stuff like that. But
Have you looked at becoming a CMMC auditor?
I have not.
So CMMC is a DoD program for assessing supply chain security. So
Okay.
for classified or unclassified information. And so interestingly enough, right now there's opportunities to get certified as either an assessor or as an auditor, but they haven't yet come up with what actually merits whether or not my company is CMMC compliant. That's sort of the next piece of it. Um, but yeah, that'd be one area that I could see if that's what you like to do is the assessing part. That'd be an interesting area to jump into. You mentioned penetration testing, the blue team, if you will, or red team, if you will, the two different ways of assessing whether or not I'm protected and can defend versus proactively going and trying to knock the house over. Is there one of those areas that looks more exciting to you than the other?
I mean, you always see in movies, so, you always see hackers
Right.
and stuff like that. So that obviously, puts the coolness of it when you're a little bit younger and stuff like that. But I think at the end of the day, I think if my mindset is more about, creating tools, kind
Sure.
of finding the vulnerabilities and then being able to create the tools. I think that would be really, really interesting. And I think that could like help on both sides for assessments and testing,
So you want to create the exploit tool, or you want to create the tool to help capture the information that says you've got an exploit happening and you need to stop it.
I think more of like catching the exploit
Got
and
it.
stopping it because there's so many tools out there nowadays and to that people are still trying to figure out how to fix, and prevent. So I think starting there is the first option, and then down the road, if I ever think of a crazy idea of
Sure.
an injection or another vulnerability attack that I could exploit, then I could create a tool in the future to help prevent it. So
Well, I think we talked about this before. It reminds me of the Tesla exploit where the guy, his first hack was like, that wasn't a big deal. Here's $5,000, go away.
mhm.
And they didn't let him finish. And it's like, well, the second exploit is, hey, go out to your parking lot. I want you to identify a car in the parking lot, like read off the last four digits of the VIN number. So I don't just do some random car. And he proceeded to back it out. And they're like, whoa, you did the recall function on a Tesla in our parking lot. And then he says, I have access to all of the Tesla cars that you have that are out in the world today. And so they were a little bit kinder on the second, bonus fine. Here's, I think it was 35 or $50,000. I don't remember the exact number was. But what I found interesting is that they were so willing to give a reward on that second round instead of saying, hey, would you like to work with us? And we're going to send you a Tesla and we want you to uncover all of the bugs you can find with this car. No, they were like, hey, you found it, go away. Please stop finding bugs with our system. You're making us look bad. Which I
Yeah,
find that interesting with the whole space right now. It's like we're more concerned about keeping the rewards to a minimum than we are about getting rid of the bugs in the first place.
yeah, but I think it's kind of interesting about that story too, because you hear other stories about, the DoD picking up some kid, that hacked, that hacked something, or not, or whatnot. And because I know that those things do happen, but I don't
Sure.
know. I feel like money is a big priority for those people on the other side of the deal. Like kind of just going right back briefly to the pipeline. I remember reading a little excerpt of what that group, the hacking group, said, and they just pretty much just wanted the money. They didn't really want to cause much harm, which
Right.
I
It
thought
kind
was
of,
really interesting to think about.
yeah, the repercussions of what actually happened was allegedly not their intent, right? Like
Hmm.
we just want to get paid, we'll turn it back on. We're just kind of like, we're kind of good guys, even though we're bad guys, letting you know, hey, you're vulnerable, you should get this fixed, pay us and we'll undo the damage. And then it kind of spiraled beyond what they were capable of doing, which raises the question, were these truly hackers that did this exploit, or were they just good enough to find a resource on the dark web that would allow them to create the exploit without being, say, superb hackers?
Yeah, and I think that the same thing goes along with the big Twitter hack that happened last summer, I think. And all that kid did was, call up one of the Twitter employees and was able to get some of the information from them in order to get into their systems. So it wasn't entirely complicated. He kind of just phoned up the guy and just acted like another team member. So.
Well, that's like the beginning of hacking as we know it. So like the first account, I believe, of an actual hack that was documented, I believe, was the Cuckoo's Egg by, I think it's Cliff Chuck Stoll. Can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he wrote the book, and it was like a scenario with all of these. It was predominantly a social engineering attack that used, got the admin password, things were default, like they are today. But it was really interesting because the whole course of the hack, this is like the late 70s. And what was interesting about it is if I fast forward to today, we still deal with the exact same problems, but instead of having to dial into a computer somewhere, all the computers are connected all the time and I don't need to dial into anything.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the security training and awareness a lot. About kind of how frequent it should be. And how to inform the people about it and the employees, because a lot of the traditional views is putting up a presentation or a model and putting somebody through a lecture. And um, I was just kind of curious about your thoughts about the virtual reality and also AR, about how that could kind of aid in security awareness and training. I know it's being used in the healthcare field, especially for
Sure.
like surgeons and stuff like that. But I just kind of want to hear your kind of view on that stuff.
Well, I'll throw this out there. We talked a little bit about this before, about cloud systems and on-prem systems and the tools that are used. And I think this kind of goes hand in hand. If I think about the sophistication of technology and like VR goggles and the PS5 that's out, and the ability to really step into a world that's not real and have an experience that is lifelike, makes me think that, to your point, we can do presentations all day, but until we mimic real world scenarios, do tabletop exercise as part of that educational maturity with our peers and clients, I don't think we will ever be able to truly say my team is ready for anything or most things, because even the incidents that we are educating them on, they've never gone through a simulation of that actual incident. They're saying now, like, phishing simulations to test their employees on whether or not they would click on the phishing attack is starting to question the validity of doing that, because you get used to it. You get desensitized to, okay, that was just a simulation. That was a simulation. But then it's not a simulation, and then they click on it.
Yeah, and that almost and that often happens. I feel like with too much automation, and I don't know,
Yeah.
is that a thing that does happen? Because sometimes I might see like a service provider, they might it's all about, securing your processes as fast as possible. And sometimes I feel like people just put as much automation on there as possible instead
Right.
of picking and choosing. I don't know if you see that in your field often, or
We all want an easy button, right? We all do. In fact, we wouldn't have had a commercial with an easy button in it if that wasn't a thing. So I think one of the challenges that we have in cybersecurity is if I can automate this, I solve a problem. If I can script this and remove the people part of this, I solve another problem. And the reality is that so much of this is tied directly to people that we've got to be careful that we don't remove people too frequently from the equation, because we then end up right back where we started with, we now have a problem and we need more people to solve it.
yeah,
So it's a catch 22, but I go back to what you said, education from the perspective of educating to educate, to check a box, right? Like, hey, I educated you shouldn't do this. Well, I think about like a phishing simulation. Well, what's the repercussions of me clicking on it, right? If we were to simulate the real deal, what actually would that look like? How do I walk an employee through more of like, this is the reality that could have happened because of what you did? In theory, you'd be less prone to continue to click on emails without giving it some thought. And I think this is that the age old saying of, um, I could bring you a fish or I could teach you how to fish. So if I think about like a phishing simulation, and my goal is to prevent you from clicking on an actual phishing attack, instead of me doing a 30-minute or an hour long like examples of phishing email, type stuff or social engineering, why not do the exercises as more of like a real time in person, like walk through it. Like, don't just walk through, does it look like it's bad? Because we can always find something that's bad about somebody's email. I'm prone to send emails that are not not grammatically correct on a regular basis. That's usually an indicator that you probably have potential spam or some sort of phishing attack, right? Like, who's sending it? It's probably not the best at grammar. Well, as people continue to click less and less on those that are bad, well, then the grammar is going to improve to then re-engage that same audience. And I think if you look for patterns, or if you know the like sort of the backstory. So like, for example, your bank's not going to send you an email to log in and change your password. They're just not going to do that. But that doesn't mean that everybody knows that. So are we educating them on what to look for in the email? Or is this email out of place? The email itself, not the contents of the email, the idea that you got an email that's asking you these types of questions. No differently than when the phone rings and it says, hey, your credit card's been compromised. Please give me the last 4 digits of your social security number. We can get that fixed. And you're like, who is this? Like we're so quick to give information away. It's mind boggling, but I think that's part of the problem.
yeah, I definitely think so too. And I think like you were kind of describing, like a little bit of like a hybrid ideology, where you're having the awareness of, what to expect, or even, what might happen potentially in the future, like a potential risk. I think those are really important about knowing. Um,
You shouldn't
uh,
get punished for making a mistake, right? If
mhm,
you have a big project due and the deadline is tomorrow and you miss the deadline, generally speaking, the person who missed the deadline doesn't get fired because they missed a deadline. There might be a consequence, there might be a penalty, but you're not just fired. The idea behind teaching someone not to click on, say, a bad email isn't going to be like, well, if you click on it and you're wrong, then you're fired. Well, I'm not going to click on anything. Now I can't do my job.
mhm. Yeah, I literally brings up. I hate to mention it, but I remember you talking about in one of your earlier podcasts about you hitting 3 clicks for Google. It was some Google users and employees.
Oh yeah, to undo
Yeah,
the delete.
yeah, to undo the delete and stuff like that. And I think that's a prime example of what you're kind of talking about. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is no perfect, and I think that we need to stop striving for that perfect scenario and need to focus on education and an understanding that says you will make mistakes. Let's try to minimize those together,
Hmm.
and make it clear that the person who's suggesting that we do a phishing campaign or that we do any of those things to help raise awareness is not siloed to you work for me, therefore you're going to do it. It's we are going to do this together. We all need to do it. So next week, Tuesday, I'm doing a training on, they're calling it cybersecurity required training. And to give you an example of how well we all pay attention to instructions. So you get an email, you pull it up. At the very top of the email, it says, go through and pick your sessions. And by the way, you have to pick cybersecurity as one of the sessions that you take. There will be 3 times that this is offered throughout the day. Pick one. Each one can hold up to 50 people in the session. We had over 20 people send emails because they didn't pick a required session, asking for someone to help them undo what they've done so they can now go back in and pick cybersecurity as one of the sessions. The whole session is going to be about password management and password, securing, having a good password or password
Hmm.
hygiene. And yet all of those that failed because they didn't read the instructions.
Yeah, I feel I've kind of noticed that trend in general also when providers are trying to talk to employees to bring awareness or ask for to make changes
Right.
or something like that. So like, how do you kind of go about when a company asks you to improve security within your organization when you're not getting any responses to like to employees and people that you're working with? Do you just kind of like close the ticket and kind of like CC the boss, and then like is that kind of the deal, or kind of how do you try to go about that to like improve communication, because that's a
Sure.
huge thing.
Well, that's it right there, improving communication. So COVID, I think, was the worst thing that could happen to anybody that's a poor communicator, right? Because now
Hmm.
I'm not in person. But one of the things I think that is really important is that you, well, you can, how do you educate the unwilling? How do you train somebody that doesn't want to be trained? How do you get participation from someone who doesn't want to participate? And I think it's showing them when there's something that is close to home that this isn't just going to potentially hurt them. Who else does it potentially hurt around them? So I have some examples where like I've had email password credentials get compromised, and I finally just have to go and sit down with the person and have a not so fun conversation, almost like an argument. I'll give you an example. I had a user who had a password that was compromised, and immediately the response I get from them is in defense mode. I don't use that password anymore. Okay. This password was compromised in January of this year. I understand that you don't use it anymore. Um, do you use a variation of that password with any of your accounts? There's a pause, and then in still in defense mode says, but not for anything important. I said, okay, help me understand what is and isn't important to you with regards to creating accounts online. And the next thing out of his mouth was, if it's not for personal, then I don't care. I said, so, okay, walk me through what is personal versus what is not. So, personal to him was bank account, um, social media was personal. So, like Facebook, Instagram, those were personal. And then I said, okay, well, then talk to me about what's not personal. So he's like, well, the applications I use for school or for work that are not, I don't put personal information into, it's just my credentials. I said, okay, on the work side, how many of those sites that you go to are in the background have data about you, first name, last name, maybe date of birth? And I gave him a couple other examples, and he's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, okay, then let's go back to personal. I said, on the bank or social media, why do you consider those to be important enough to better protect? And so he gave me some examples. I go, okay, I'm going to say for argument's sake that you've made a good decision on separating what is important, what is not important, and it's not a big deal. I said, next question. I said, and be careful how you answer this. I said, do you log into those accounts for personal and work in the same browser on the same computer with more than one tab open at the same time? He's like, absolutely. I said, okay, so what you're telling me is those things that are important and not important are now living together in the same space. So there is no discernment anymore on the computer that you're using as to what is personal and what is not personal. And he's quiet for a minute and he's like, what do you propose? I said, I would start with changing all of your passwords because you're telling me that you don't use good password hygiene out of the gate. And I said, I'm not saying that to attack or blame you for it. I'm saying that to you because I too suffer from the same problem that you have and every other human on this planet. If you have 5 unique passwords that are strong passwords, password number 6 will be very difficult, if not impossible, for you to remember. But people have 10, 15, 20 passwords that are all more or less the same password with some sort of variation or the same.
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies the problem. I mean, if you look at like, there was a database that just published that they had like 300 million passwords in this database. Of those passwords, 44% were unique. The follow-up was, but none of them were secure. None of them were strong passwords. That was like, I think it was like 6% or 8% were strong passwords, which tells me like, 44% means less than half of those passwords were unique. So 150 million people or 150 million passwords were more or less shared passwords.
Yeah, and what makes them unique though? Like, because they could just be some of those passwords in that set. Because I'm assuming that like it was kind of picked over. It wasn't hand picked of like this one's unique and this one's not unique. I don't know. That could have been the case, but I don't know if it was like
Yeah,
super relational to somebody, that
right.
uses like leet letters and all these other crazy things, and that only makes sense to them. But I think it still goes with exactly what you're saying. It's crazy to see those statistics.
Well,
So
I'll throw this out there. I'll leave this as the last one. If you use the word password as your password, we would all argue that that's bad. But
yes.
what if your password is password in Portuguese?
Mm-hmm.
So while I may not, me personally, be able to guess that, I could probably take a stab at running a dictionary tool that says run every known language, spoken language, and the word password and see what happens. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have to know it, right? But I know that the word password is pretty generic. And lo and behold, I don't remember off the top of my head what the word for password in Portuguese is, but it is in the top 20 most frequently used passwords that you shouldn't use.
Yeah, and there's since I've gained a lot of interest in the penetration testing, I also have a lot of interest in password lists, and there are so many online with the most common ones, and there's also programs out there that you put in simple facts about the person that
Yeah.
and then it literally creates a whole list for them like that too, and it's really interesting to see what is truly a unique password and what is not.
Well, and let's just assume it's a unique password for a
Yeah.
moment. If the database has been compromised that has the passwords and they've been decrypted, then let's just say it was those 300 million passwords. Sure, they're unique, but I don't need to know your password to say, let's run it against this 300 million password bank and see what happens.
Mhm.
So if you were a LinkedIn compromise and you haven't changed it, or some other environment, if you haven't changed the password after an event where the database is compromised, well, then you've got a password that's just sitting out there waiting for someone to try it.
Definitely.
Listen, I know we could talk probably all day about passwords. As we wrap up this week's episode, Matthew, where can people find you?
You guys can
Not your geolocation per se, not longitude,
yeah,
latitude, but
you could probably just find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to follow to get in touch with me. And if not, through Chris too.
yep, you can definitely reach out to me. I'm more than happy to share his contact details and his passwords if I find them. This has been MSP 1337. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.